Okay. Oops. I've got to do this rather quickly because my computer's about to run out of batteries. Today's the fourth lecture of medical psychology. It's about personality. I'll put the video up, and I'll also put actually two more quizzes up this weekend. Sorry for the first one should be up, but the second two I haven't finished deciding on the questions for. So personality. Last time we talked about intelligence. This time we're going to talk about personality. We started off last time thinking about what is intelligence. How do we define intelligence? And we looked at different ways and tests of measuring that. Personality is similar. In medical psychology, we want to understand what makes people different from each other. Why do people behave differently in exactly the same situation? Is there a way to quantify that in a useful way? So today I'm going to go over sort of the history of personality. First, personality from a psychophysiological viewpoint, which is the Eysenck model, and then from a descriptive viewpoint using factor analysis, looking at the big five. I'll give you an example of the personality test, which will be attached at the end of this PDF, and then I'll look over two final things. One is heritability, so the effect of genes on personality traits, and finally personality and health. How can personality affect your health? Why is it important for us as medical psychologists? So personality. Do you have siblings? Do you have any brothers or sisters? Do you have similar character or personality to your siblings? That would imply it's genetically or maybe environmentally based. Often I think people would consider that yes, people are more similar to their siblings on average than another random person you choose. The problem is, of course, what do we mean similar, right? What is character? What is personality? What do these words mean? How do we define them usefully in a way that we can test? Well, we have some assumptions, right? People have some traits, some characteristics that constitute their personality. These traits are dispositions. They're biases to respond in certain ways given certain situations. For example, like if someone attacks you, some people will attack back, some people won't. Those are two different dispositions to respond to a certain kind of stimulus. And finally, importantly, traits are stable over time in different situations. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a personality. It would just be that one time. So the first method that was used in a sort of scientific empirical way was called factor analysis. And it's actually a really sort of ingenious idea. You collect all the personality related words in a dictionary in English. So happy, considerate, mean, angry, nice, ornery, hateful. Allport and Olbert, two scientists, did this in 1936. They found about 4,500 words in English that describe personality. And of course, we're assuming here that the English language can describe all the variation of personality that people will have. But of course, there's probably not 4,500 different types of personality, right? Maybe nice and considerate are similar. The same people will use these two words to describe the same people most of the time, right? So what we do is we reduce the number of dimensions by combining, people that are both this and this together into one category. So for example, sort of negative example here, Donald Trump is petty, insecure, vengeful, and mean. Adolf Hitler was insecure, mean, and angry, right? We can see that they share insecure and they share mean, right? So usually when you say someone's insecure, you're also going to say that they're mean. It's just the way that personality seems to work. So the words are correlated with each other. If you share one word, you're also more than likely than not to share some other words. Those words are called correlated, right? And by doing this, we can extract those categories of words that are correlated, and they're called factors, kind of like factoring out a number in a multiplication, right? It's called factor analysis. And I'll give you an example here. So we use many different personality descriptors to describe people. And let's get the correlation between terms. So here we have 5 things I've made up to describe people. Risk averse, likes to talk to people, has mood swings often, and is laid back, and likes to travel, right? So these 5 different things. And I'm going to look at, so these are the same ones here and here. And I'm going to describe, look at the correlations between them, how often they co-occur when describing people. So we find, first of all, that there's a cluster of people who like to talk to people and risk averse is negatively correlated, right? That means that usually people who are risk averse don't like to talk to people. They're negatively correlated. People who like to talk to people often like to travel. They're positively correlated. And finally, And those are the two combinations, right? And of course, risk averse is always 100% correlated with risk averse. They're always correlated with themselves. Oops, my battery's going to run out. With a correlation of 1, because they always co-occur, right? Next, this is really annoying. That is really annoying. Okay. Why is that turning on and off? That's really annoying. Anyways, okay. The second category, so we can find a name for this. Maybe we'll call it the sort of exploratory people. They like to talk to people, they like to travel, but they're not risk averse. They do like risk. They like new things. Second category, let's say, has mood swings. It's correlated with laid back with negative correlation of 0.7. So in general, if you're laid back, you don't have mood swings. So that's the second possible category, cluster. And so we can categorize those clusters. So those are two sort of descriptive continui that describe people, right? So Eysenck used factor analysis to describe 3 factors of personality, basically. Extroversion, introversion dimension, the neuroticism, also called emotional stability dimension, and psychoticism. There was weaker evidence in his factor analysis for that. And it's important to note these factors are descriptive continua. So people are not either introvert or extrovert, but they're along a continuous dimension. You could be somewhere in between. I'll give you some examples in Eysenck's model. Extroversion, they were sensation-seeking, venturesome, lively, carefree, sociable, dominant, active, assertive. People with high neuroticism tend to be tense, anxious, moody, emotional, irrational, have low self-esteem, depressed, shy, or have feelings of guilt. And people with high psychoticism were impulsive, aggressive, tough-minded, antisocial, cold, not empathetic, egocentric, or creative. And based on this model, he thought that this would shape your personality by trying to get sort of an optimal stimulation level in the relevant dimensions of stimuli. So for example, in terms of introverts, they would want a lower level of stimulation because they respond more strongly. They're more sensitive to stimulation. And so they try to keep stimulation low, and that gives them the optimal sort of feeling, like reading a book at home. Extroverts, on the other hand, they're less sensitive to stimulation, so they need more stimulation to get the same feeling of good feeling, right? And so they want to go, for example, bungee jumping, an extreme example. Following Eysenck's model, there was a sort of newer theory hypothesis called the Big Five. And it basically found 5 main factors of personality. This was from Goldberg, 1981. And the test uses often this Costa and McCree test, which is the NEO-PIR, the Neuroticism, Extroversion, Openness, Personality Inventory Revised, is what was used to test for the Big Five. Similar to Eysenck's model, right, this includes an extroversion, which has things like warmth, gregariousness, talkativeness, right, assertiveness, activity, excitement, seeking, etc. It has emotional stability, which is kind of the opposite of neuroticism, so it's another dimension like Eysenck's, which includes being anxious, angry, hostile, depressed, impulsive, or vulnerable. Openness is another sort of new factor that was found, sometimes called intellect or imagination. It's sort of having fantastic ideas, aesthetics, feelings, actions, ideas, or values. The fourth factor is agreeableness, which includes trust, straightforwardness, altruism, compliance, modesty, or tender-mindedness. And finally, the fifth is called conscientiousness, which includes competence, order, dutifulness, achievement, striving, self-discipline, and deliberation. It's kind of how much self-control you have, kind of, and competent you are. So we're going to look at the International Personality Item Pool, IPIP, as a way to score someone's personality, to find out what personality they are. And this includes various questions that sort of decide where you are in each of these 5 categories, with either a plus, which means that question, if you answer a high on it, you add that to that category, or minus items, where if you add to it, it sort of subtracts you, it takes you to the other extreme of that category. So for example, being extroverted or introverted, If it's a plus item, it will make you extroverted. If it's a minus item, answering that question with a high value will make you more introverted. And of course, this is a good, objective, valid test. Think about that. Maybe I'll ask a question about that, because you're just adding up numbers, and the people who responded are probably going to respond similarly to similar questions. So for example, some of the questions are, you don't talk a lot. And then if they answer very inaccurate, it means so they do talk a lot. That will give plus 5 points for extroversion. Number 11, feel comfortable around people. If they answer with moderately accurate, this is a negative, so this is a positive one, you'll get plus 1 points for extroversion. Plus 4 points for extroversion. Right, so you can see this is sort of a negative question or a positive question decides which way you add it. And so these are the type of questions you have in the IPIP. There's an example of IPIP 50 questions in the back of the slides I gave. One interesting thing that actually came out recently is they found so people will fall into one of these, or people will have a value on each of these sort of 5 dimensions of personality, right? They'll be either extroverted or introverted. So between -1 and 1, they'll be between agreeable or disagreeable, between -1 and 1, and so on. Actually, there was a nice paper that came out last year or the year before that showed that most people, if you look at their values between 1 and -1, for the 5 different categories: neuroticism, extroversion, openness, agreeableness, and conscientiousness, if you look at where they fall, then there's actually 4 different clusters of people, 4 different types of people. One they called the average person, who has high relative 0.5 neuroticism, high extroversion, low sort of negative openness, so they're not very open and not super sort of creative, I guess you'd say. And then they have slightly positive agreeableness and conscientiousness. The second type they called self-centered, and this was mostly teenage boys, if I remember. And they have sort of slightly negative neuroticism, very high extroversion, so they're always sort of thrill-seeking, and then negative consciousness, open, and agreeableness. Fourth type was called reserved. They had negative openness, negative neuroticism, so they were pretty sort of laid back, but they have basically 0 or average in between consciousness, agreeableness, and extroversion. And finally was role model type, which was kind of the best type, probably maybe one of the rarer ones. Have negative neuroticism, so they're very laid back, and they have positive extroversion, openness, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. Not everyone falls into these categories, of course. People will have slight variance away from these exact categories. This is the mean category. These are the standard deviations, so you can imagine people are quite varied in where they are. One might be up here and down here, and the other one might be up here and down here, for example, right? But on average, I think it was 40 or 50 or 60% of people fell into these 4 categories. This was done via cluster analysis. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is the effect of genes on personality. So last time we saw that there was an effect of genes of your on intelligence, on IQ, right? One thing we didn't talk about is something else, which is the birth order. So birth order is, for example, what order you're born among siblings, right? And these are siblings who are raised together usually, right? So actually, it turns out that intelligence does have a slight birth order effect. So if you're born first, you on average have a slightly higher, a few points of IQ, higher than second, third, or fourth born. And in general, the IQ decreases as your birth order increases, as you are born later. Possible hypothesized reason is maybe firstborns serve as teachers for their siblings. So there's an environmental effect. We know that there is some effective environment on IQ because, of course, the heritability is not 100%. So it makes sense that there would be, or not 200%, I guess. So it makes sense that there would be some effective environment on intelligence, possibly this type serving as teachers for their siblings, messing with IQ. Interestingly, there is no effect of birth order on any of the personality traits. And this is very surprising for a lot of people because people tend to think of, the firstborn's more sort of responsible and, less risk-taking. The baby is sort of more selfish. The lastborn is more selfish. The secondborn is more sort of free and, does whatever he wants. Same with thirdborn, this type of thing. But it turns out that, on average, there is no birth order effect on personality. In terms of genes, however, there is an effect. So remember last time we looked at the effect, how heritable intelligence was based on comparison of monozygotic identical versus dizygotic fraternal twins. Remember the monozygotic twins share 100% of their genes. Dizygotic twins share 50% of their genes. So by looking at the difference in intelligence or personality factors, personality traits, we can try to figure out how much of an effect the genes have on your personality traits. So remember the H-squared effect, H2 index is 2 times the correlation. R here, remember, is correlation between monozygotic twins for that specific thing. So for example, extroversion, minus the correlation of dizygotic twins for that same specific trait, for example, extroversion. And so the correlation of between monozygotic twins for different personality traits, the big 5, are about 0.5, a little bit higher, a little bit lower, whereas the correlation of dizygotic twins for the same are between 0.13 and the highest was 0.35. This is based on a study from 1997 that looked at German and Polish twins. And based on these numbers, we can use this equation to calculate the heritability index, the H2 index, which shows that basically neuroticism is 80% heritable, conscientiousness is 72, and the lowest one is openness, which is only 38% heritable. But other studies, some USA and American and Canadian twin studies actually showed that these numbers might be a little bit too high or too low sometimes. They found between 49 and 56 for extroversion, 42 and 52 for neuroticism, 33 and 42 for agreeableness, 48 to 53 for conscientiousness, and 51 to 58 for openness. So take these with a grain of salt because, for example, this number is reversed between these two sets of studies. But in any case, it seems that there is a significant effect of genes on personality. So these are mostly around 50%, which implies that it's a significant effect of genes on personality. Next, we're going to talk about personality and health. So we talked about the heritability of personality. Why is this important for us as medical psychologists? Well, it turns out that personality can, of course, have an effect on your health. One of the major effects that has been studied since the 1950s was the effect on cardiovascular disease. So does your personality make you more likely to have a heart attack, right? You'd imagine if you're a very stressed, anxious individual, maybe you'll be more likely to have a heart attack, or if you're very, chill and laid back, you're less likely. That's exactly what these two cardiologists, Friedman and Rosenman, proposed in 1959. They postulated 2 types of personality called the type A personality, which they defined as driven to achieve, competitive, hostile, alert, dislikes time wasting. And then there's the type B personality, which are the relaxed, unhurried, less interested in competition personality. And they measured these two, they categorized patients into these 2 personalities based on a structured interview or a self-report questionnaire. So the first report from Rosenman, one of the original 2 cardiologists, and some other colleagues, showed that there was a link between type A personality and heart disease. But follow-up studies later on showed that they couldn't reproduce this effect. They didn't find a significant correlation between the type A versus type B and the cardiovascular disease. In fact, what they found were better at predicting cardiovascular disease. Bigger risk factors were blood pressure, cholesterol, smoking, and age. Further meta-analysis more recently, 2009, showed that actually hostility and anger was a risk factor of coronary heart disease. And of course, that kind of makes sense, as we've talked about, because hostility or anger could cause a sympathetic nervous system stress response when a hostile person is provoked, which causes a higher blood pressure. And we know that blood pressure causes is a risk factor for heart disease. So there's sort of a jump to inferences there. You can figure out how a certain personality trait causes cardiovascular disease. It makes sense. Okay, so that's all for personality today. Today we talked about why people are different from one another. Can we categorize people based on their personality? First, we learned about the psychophysiological viewpoint, the Eysenck model, categorized with people are basically have three main traits: the extroversion versus introversion, psychoticism versus non-psychoticism, and the excuse me, I don't want to get this wrong. I forget the exact words he used. Neuroticism versus emotional stability. And then later on, these actually similar, three of those were included in the Big Five, which personality from a descriptive viewpoint, which looked at used factor analysis to define five major dimensions along which people's personality can be described. And that's done using, for example, a personality test like the IP 50 questions I give you, which are at the end of these slides. Then next we talked about heritability of personality traits. Personality traits were affected by your genes, but not by the birth order of siblings, whereas intelligence was affected by birth order and also by genes. And finally, we talked about the effect of personality on health. So specifically, personality could affect, for example, the risk of coronary heart disease based on its connection with stress responses. So that's all for today. I will put up this video, of course, and the quiz for last class. I still haven't put that up, and the one for this class, personality. And then I think next week we have our first sort of live interactive session. So I'll start putting up some questions for you guys to think about for that.